Okay, everyone, my apologies on that. We're calling an audible here. Okay, so let's review a little bit our what is fair housing. Obviously, we should all know what that is. We've all taken this similar classes multiple times. The federal government does not allow discrimination for any residential rental dwellings, financing, insuring, or purchasing of housing based on race, color, religion, disability, familial status, national origin, or sex. Those are our protected classes. We can go ahead and move to the next slide, Ed. Oh, there we go. So in our state, we have the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act of 1976, which added age and marital status to the protected classes. Now, obviously, our industry is local. We need to know what our local municipalities, if any, are adding to those protected classes. That's ever changing. And so know your communities, know if your local townships or cities are adding to those classes. So sexual orientation and gender identity are a hot topic currently. There's currently a ballot initiative to add those to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act under the sex classification. Though that ballot initiative is not expected to pass, there is also a court case currently. Oral arguments were beginning of March this year. And that case, we're expected to have the ruling here shortly, sometime, I believe, this summer, on whether or not gender identity and sexual orientation are covered under the sex classification of Elliott Larson. This is a very unique case because the state Supreme Court allowed the case to go directly to them and skip the Michigan Court of Appeals. Now, even though federal and local and state requirements may be different, our NAR Code of Ethics already classifies sexual orientation and gender identity as a protected class under Article 10. So when we join the association, our professional trade, we're agreeing to follow those Code of Ethics. And as you can see here, all of our, not only are all the federal classes covered, but sexual orientation and gender identity. So prohibited classes for, or prohibited practices for the protected classes. Steering. We should all know that that is based on one of the protected classes, pushing a client to buy or to not buy in a designated area based on race, orientation, marital status, disability, etc. More than likely, it's going to be unintentional steering because we believe that it's best for the client. Again, Code of Ethics violation, fair housing violation. Blockbusting. Thankfully, we don't see that much in the current times, but that is going to a client or a potential seller and saying, this demographic is moving in, dropping the prices, and taking over the neighborhood. Refusal to rent or sell. So again, doesn't happen very often based on the protected classes, more so in the rental aspect of things. But again, that is a major issue on the rental side. I believe it was 55% of our claims, fair housing violation claims nationally, are based on refusal to rent based on one of those demographics. Disparate impact. That is a change, I think, since 15, where a requirement based on the seller, the landlord, may not directly be in violation of fair housing, but the end result is. And so one great example of that is a landlord who requires proof of employment. Well, a renter may have, say, disability payments, and they can qualify income-wise for that rental, but because they cannot show proof of employment, that would fall under number 4, disparate impact. And number 5, which is what we're going to spend most of our time today, discriminatory advertising. And so I will hand it off to Becky Gean, and she will take it from here.
Thank you, Aaron. Aaron was part of our 2020 and technically 2021 Michigan Realtors Leadership Academy, and as part of their training, they were trained to be fair housing educators. So I'm happy that we got to give you a chance to showcase your fair housing knowledge and get going with that. Okay, so our next topic is going to be advertising and fair housing. And then as we go through this stuff, if you have any questions, shout them out, or I guess raise your hand. Maybe don't shout, but raise your hand and we'll work through any of those questions that you have. So before we dive deep into advertising and fair housing, we do kind of need to talk about just the basic advertising requirements under Michigan law, because these basic advertising requirements do actually matter quite a bit to advertising in the fair housing context. So Michigan advertising law says that at a minimum, any piece of real estate advertising has to include at least 2 things. It has to include, first, the licensed name of the employing broker, and it also has to include the employing broker's telephone number or their street address. You don't have to have both of those things. You don't have to have both the telephone number and the street address. You just have to have one of them. But these basic requirements under the law, like I said, actually really matter quite a bit for fair housing, because when a fair housing violation occurs, we need to know who's liable for that violation. And we have to identify the broker, because at the end of the day, the broker bears the ultimate responsibility for the actions of their agents, including any fair housing violations. And that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but definitely one of the reasons why Michigan law requires this identification of the broker. And then next slide. So, yay, okay, that works. I guess I don't need to hold this clicker. And identifying that employing broker, like I said, is important, because that employing broker is responsible for any liability that stems from the practice of those agents within that brokerage. So, you know, this threat of liability for the brokerage is always there, and that threat of liability should really be great incentive for brokerages to, you know, look at their internal policies, and then if needed, create a plan for how to address any potential fair housing violations. We always say that the best defense to a potential fair housing violation is the fact that you have some kind of meaningful policy in place that addresses fair housing compliance. And of course, you know, having these compliance policies in place isn't going to immediately absolve the brokerage and the agents from, you know, any and all liability, but it does help to mitigate the risk. And, you know, having a focus on advertising is a really good place to start, because that's usually where we see most fair housing violations. And next slide. So what you see up here, this is what fair housing law specifically says about real estate advertising. And I'm not going to bore you by reading this whole block of text, but the gist here is that you cannot make or publish an advertisement for housing that discriminates based on a protected classification. Those protected classes are what Aaron talked about. It's, you know, race, color, religion, handicap, sex, religion, disability, national origin, you know, sexual orientation, sexual orientation, gender identity, under the Realtor Code of Ethics. And, you know, when we're talking about discrimination in advertising, you know, discrimination against these protected classes, that discrimination can really happen in one of 2 ways. It can be done through words or phrases that either expressly discriminate, or that can be a little bit more implied, or it can happen through using human models or or geographic locations that, imply a preference or that, sort of target a certain demographic. But regardless of how it's done, it is illegal to advertise in any way that, indicates some preference toward or against these protected classes. So we have to be really careful in how we create these advertisements. And compliance is really important here because the consequences for non-compliance are really steep. There's the obvious emotional damage that occurs when someone is a victim of discrimination that, no one should have to experience, but there are also serious financial consequences. And next slide. And so, we have these financial consequences in addition to the costs of defending yourself in a potential lawsuit for that fair housing violation. We also have these HUD penalties, and HUD imposes civil fines for advertisements that violate fair housing law. And these penalties can be really hefty. A first-time violation can cost up to $20,000 in fines. If the Department of Justice gets involved, which they usually do, that turns out being really nasty or something that gains a lot of national attention, that FUD, man, can you tell it's Thursday? That HUD fine can climb up to $100,000. So we're not talking about chump change here. This is, big financial consequences, and those fines are steep. They're really harsh and they're really impactful. But I think that the biggest concern here is your public image and your loss of reputation. We work in an industry where your reputation is everything, and you don't want to be known as the agent who violates fair housing law and who discriminates against potential clients. That's a business killer. So that's why we try to be so proactive, in making sure that our practices align with fair housing law. And this is why brokerages are encouraged to do everything they can to make sure that their agents' advertising is complying with fair housing law. And next slide. So this brings us to what we like to call the golden rules of real estate advertising. And these are just some best practices to keep in mind when you're creating your advertisements and how to keep them in compliance with fair housing. The first golden rule, and there's a reason that this one is in red, highlighted, and bolded. It's, in my opinion, one of the most important ones, and you'll probably get tired of hearing me say this phrase throughout the next hour, but it is to just describe the property, don't describe the person. This is probably the most important rule to keep in mind when we're talking about trying to keep our advertisements compliant with fair housing law. You should really only be describing the physical attributes of the property. You want to avoid describing the ideal occupant or who you would perceive as the ideal occupant or the ideal potential purchaser for a property. Once you start describing your idea of an ideal occupant, that's when we start running afoul of fair housing law. So, for example, if I were to say, turnkey house with a small backyard, perfect for empty nesters, that phrasing is fine in the first half, right? The part about turnkey home, small backyard, we're good there, right? That's just describing the physical attributes of the property, no risk running afoul of fair housing law. But as soon as I say perfect for empty nesters, or really perfect for any fill in the blank, that's when we have a problem, because now I'm describing an ideal purchaser or my idea of an ideal purchaser. That phrase isn't blatantly discriminatory. If I said perfect for empty nesters, that's not saying no children. That's not saying no families or, no young couples. But it does kind of paint a picture that maybe older couples are preferred, and we really want to avoid creating any idea of a preference. That leads us to our second best practice up here, which is advertising for housing should not state or imply a preference based on an individual's protected class status. So an advertisement for housing should never make a member of any protected class feel like they are either unwelcome or like they are unwanted. The phrase family neighborhood is one that gives us trouble all the time. It's a phrase that we see all the time in real estate advertising. And it's a phrase that really shouldn't be used in real estate advertising because it could imply a preference for families. Familial status is a protected class. So we can't use words or phrases in our advertisements that would imply that families are the only groups welcome, or on the flip side, that they are not welcome at all. And I think that a big piece of this is realizing, not only that our words matter, but also that the perception of our words matter. There are some words on their own that are completely fine, that are not discriminatory. But when we're talking about fair housing and creating advertisements, we really can't look at the words alone. We have to look at the words in conjunction with everything else. We have to look at the words in conjunction with the photos that we're using and the method that we're advertising in and who our audience is and how these advertisements could be perceived. Because when we're talking about fair housing violations and real estate advertising, perception is reality. That's just the way that it works, and context becomes really important. If you take the words, for example, inclusive or exclusive neighborhood or traditional neighborhood, those are words on their own. They're not discriminatory. There's nothing inherently discriminatory about saying traditional neighborhood. But if I take the word traditional neighborhood and I align it with other visuals and different methods of advertising, then maybe it could be perceived as discriminatory. If I take, say, the phrase traditional neighborhood and I slap that on a poster of a white family standing in front of a gated community in, the deep South on land that was once a plantation, that really changes the context, and not in a good way. When the context changes, so does the perception. And the perception there very well could be that ad indicates a preference, that maybe it's intended to be exclusionary, or maybe it's intended to create a preference for or against certain groups. And I think the point here is that, context is really important, and perception changes quickly. So when we're talking about creating advertisements in the context of staying compliant with fair housing law, we really always have to look at this stuff through the lens of fair housing and look at it through the lens of how other protected classes might be feeling when they're viewing these advertisements. And then last best practice here, advertisements for housing cannot be marketed directly to or away from members of protected classes. So what this is saying is that you cannot use target marketing to steer individuals to or away from available housing. If you intentionally exclude individuals from seeing advertisements for housing, that's also going to be a fair housing violation. Facebook was recently sued for this very practice. And I won't give too much away because I'm going to talk about that case in just a minute, but I will say that case did not end well for Facebook. That case generated a lot of interest from HUD and a lot of interest from the Department of Justice, which tells us that enforcement agencies are paying attention to online activity, especially in the context of advertising and fair housing. So it's something that should have our attention also. And it's just one more reason to make sure that our advertisements are legally compliant with regard to fair housing, especially on social media, which we'll also talk about in just a minute. And all of this can seem like a tall task. And next slide. Thank you. I feel like it's like magic back there. It just happens. But luckily for us, there is some extra guidance available, both from HUD and from local fair housing centers. HUD is really a great resource. They have published a bunch of guidelines that are really helpful in navigating some of these problematic words and phrases that tend to create perception problems. We'll talk about those in just a bit, but local fair housing centers are also a great resource. They offer trainings to realtor groups. They're always willing to come talk to brokerages and local associations and serve on panels and even do some testing work with you. So if you haven't already, I would really encourage your brokerages to reach out to those local fair housing centers. They really like to partner with realtor groups, and they're a great partner to have in all of this. A lot of local fair housing centers also have these cautionary word lists available. And these cautionary word lists are really just, lists of words that shouldn't be used in advertising. for years, newspapers and then later MLSs relied on these word lists to vet appropriate advertisements, and a lot of them still do. And these word lists are really helpful because they work to sort of, train our brains to avoid using those problematic words and phrases. So they're a great tool, but I will say that they're not a fail-safe. You really shouldn't be solely relying on these cautionary word lists when you're creating your advertisements. Next slide. Because just because, a word list doesn't, or just because an advertisement doesn't include a word that's on the banned word list, that doesn't mean that it automatically complies with fair housing law. Context and perception are still really important. Yeah, question.
I want to go back to the word list that you mentioned. Do you have any experience specifically with the word quiet, implying no screaming children as a different way of saying family?
Yeah, so we get that question often. There are a bunch of words out there that, are kind of iffy. Quiet, I believe, is one that HUD has said is okay. You can, infer what you want from it, but, the act of being quiet isn't a protected class. Yes, children might make more noise, but if that's the connection that you make to the word quiet, that's okay. One I will say, so one thing with these, the HUD words that they say are okay and that they say are not okay, one of the issues in navigating this is that HUD is, a government administration. So like other government agencies, the direction of HUD changes with the new presidential administration. So, we'll go 4 years where they say one word is okay, and then we'll maybe go 4 or 8 years, and then all of a sudden a word isn't okay. So, when you hear us flip-flopping saying, oh, it's okay, oh, it's not okay, it's not because we're just making it up. It's because that's what HUD is saying. But one word that they've backtracked on is the phrase master bedroom. There was a while where the phrase master bedroom, they said you shouldn't use. Now that's one that's okay. So that's one question we get a lot. I just wanted to throw that out there. But again, I think that the key takeaway here is that when we're creating these advertisements, just go back to that number one golden rule, which is to just describe the property. That's really the best way of minimizing any chances that there could be confusion over context and word meaning. Because if you're just describing the physical attributes of the property, then no one can come back at you and ask you, well, what did you really mean when you said XYZ? If you're just saying, it has a small fenced in backyard, that's what I mean. It has a small fenced in backyard. I'm not, you're just describing the property. So that's the key takeaway. When in doubt, describe the property. And next slide. Before we jump into the social media stuff, are there any questions about those general advertising guidelines, any of the protected class issues or prohibited practices or anything like that? Doing good. All right, we're doing good on time then. Okay, so we're going to switch gears here and talk specifically about social media and advertising. And I think that, in today's day and age, when social media marketing has become the way of doing everything, really, I think that, we kind of have to have a discussion about social media if we're going to talk about advertising and fair housing. We all use social media for everything, and it's become an integral part of doing business, especially in real estate. And I think what's important to remember when we're having this conversation about advertising and social media is that, social media it's relatively new, and it really developed quickly. It developed much faster than any of the laws that govern it. If you've ever worked in government, you know that government can move kind of slow. So social media is one of those things that exploded, and the rules and regulations that govern it just really haven't moved that fast. And what that means is that, we're working in some murky area, and there's been some unexpected avenues of liability because we're not quite sure how some of these laws apply. So what this section is all about is understanding how the law intersects with social media, and also going over some best practices for keeping your advertisements legally compliant with social media. Next slide. Awesome. All right, so when it comes to fair housing, one of the biggest areas of concern is online advertising. This is just where we see a lot of fair housing violations. And again, probably because it's so new and we're still kind of figuring out how online advertising works. But the law is very clear about how the Fair Housing Act applies to real estate advertising. In a nutshell, the law says that you cannot make or publish an advertisement for housing that discriminates based on a protected class. And what we have to remember here, front and center, is that the law applies to social media advertising just as it applies to traditional in-print advertising. There tends to be this misconception out there that, the laws are a little bit more lax with social media because social media is just so casual. But that's not true at all. Not only do the same laws apply to social media advertising, I think that we could even say that, it's more important that all of your advertisements are legally compliant on social media because you're reaching such a larger audience. So there's more room to mess up. And then when you do mess up, there's more people who see that you messed up because you're reaching this larger audience. So, and what's important to remember here again is that social media is relatively new territory. If you think about it, Facebook really only hit the scene in 2006? 2007, and then it exploded from there. And social media developed really quickly. So, we're still learning how the law applies to social media, and we're still seeing new laws emerge that govern social media. And what this means, unfortunately, is that, this new method of marketing has raised a lot of new legal questions that we're still trying to figure out the answers to. One of those new legal questions is who is considered the publisher of an advertisement when that advertisement is posted on social media. And this idea of publisher status really matters because if you publish a discriminatory advertisement for housing, you are going to be held liable for violating fair housing law. The publisher of the advertisement is just as liable as the actual creator of the advertisement. And this theory of publisher's liability, the whole reason behind, I guess, this idea of publisher's liability is that the publisher has the ability to exercise editorial control over the contents of their publications. They have the final say in what the public sees. So it makes sense that we would hold the publisher liable for, what they're putting out into the world. So determining who is and who is not a publisher here is actually really important because it tells us who, in addition to the creator of the advertisement, is going to be held liable for any fair housing violations that stem from those advertisements. We do have some really good case law on publishers' liability. So in these cases, they're showing how the courts are starting to evolve with technology and how they're starting to apply the law, to these online activities like social media and like fair housing violations that occur over social media. So the first case I wanted to tell you about involves Craigslist. And in this case, there were some Craigslist users that were creating some discriminatory housing advertisements. I believe they were landlords, and they were creating some pretty nasty ads for these apartments, saying, blatantly discriminatory things like if you're a, fill in the blank protected class, don't bother applying, we won't get along, that kind of stuff. So obvious fair housing violations. Craigslist was sued by a fair housing advocacy group on the basis that Craigslist was a publisher of these discriminatory housing advertisements. So because Craigslist was a publisher, they should be held liable for violating fair housing law. Craigslist claimed that they shouldn't be held liable because they weren't a publisher. Craigslist basically said, hey, we're a website, we're immune from liability for what third parties post on our sites. These advertisements were created by third parties. We didn't have any hand in creating the discriminatory advertisements. So, we shouldn't be held liable here. And the court agreed with Craigslist. The court said that Craigslist should not be held liable as a publisher. They said that Craigslist was really just acting in a passive manner. They were a website. All they were really doing was acting as an online bulletin board, is what the court called them. Craigslist wasn't creating the actual content. The content came from third parties. All Craigslist was doing was just facilitating a place for users to post. So the court said shouldn't be held liable for fair housing violations because they weren't a publisher. And I think that court came to the right conclusion there, because that court's rationale really aligned with the general rule that a website doesn't have liability or doesn't have publishers liability for posts made to their site by third parties, unless of course that website is doing something to help, facilitate or engage in that bad behavior by those third parties. So this case is a really good example just of how the courts are transitioning, I guess you could say, into addressing discrimination online. They're really upholding the idea that publishers' liability lies with the creator of the advertisement, but also with the publisher of the advertisement. And it's nice because we're starting to see the court set parameters for determining publisher status, in the context of these, fair housing violations online. Next slide. There is another case that's given us some more guidance on this issue of how publishers' liability can be applied to fair housing violations on social media. This case involved Facebook. You might have heard of this one, but just for some background, Facebook has been under a great deal of scrutiny over the last few years, just in how they collect user data and what they do with that user data and what they allow advertisers to do with that user data. And this recent lawsuit also involved the collection of user data, but this time it involved the housing industry. So this started back in 2018 when Facebook was sued by the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is another fair housing advocacy group. And this lawsuit alleged that Facebook's advertising platform violated fair housing law, and that it did so by allowing housing advertisers to target market to certain Facebook users and then exclude those users from seeing advertisements for housing based on their race and their sex and their familial status and all the other protected classes. So how it worked is when these housing advertisers were selecting their target audience, they would be given a drop-down menu that included a pre-populated list of user demographics. And those user demographics were largely based on protected class status. So advertisers could then select which demographics and which protected classes they wanted to exclude from seeing their advertisements for housing. So for example, if I was a housing advertiser and if I was selecting my target audience, I could go through and say, okay, don't show my advertisement to women with children. Don't show my advertisement to people who are interested in assistance animals or deaf culture or African cooking or the Bible or Southeast Asia, the list goes on. So, this type of exclusion, right? Excluding people from seeing advertisements for housing based on a protected classification is a pretty blatant fair housing violation. And the big argument here was that we would never let this practice happen if we were talking about traditional in-print advertising, right? A realtor or a landlord could never, discriminate against a home buyer or a tenant in that way. If I was an agent and if I wanted to publish my housing advertisement in the newspaper, I could never walk into the newspaper office and say, hello, editor, here's my housing advertisement. Please publish it in the Sunday paper, but make sure that women with children don't see it, right? Maybe just don't deliver the paper to them on that day, right? That sounds insane. We would never let that happen. So the argument here is that if we don't let this activity to happen in traditional print advertising, then why are we allowing it to happen online? Facebook, of course, argued that they were not a publisher of these advertisements, so they should not be held liable for any fair housing violations that stemmed from those advertisements. Their argument was that they were just like Craigslist. They were a passive website who was just facilitating a place for people to post stuff. But the court didn't buy that argument from Facebook. The Department of Justice got involved in this one and said that Facebook should be held liable as a publisher, and they should be liable for these fair housing violations. The Department of Justice said, hey, look, Facebook, you're doing way more than what Craigslist did. Craigslist was truly just a passive website that allowed people to post on it. What you're doing, Facebook, is way more. You are actually participating in the creation of these discriminatory advertisements. It's your data collection and it's your algorithms that are even making this possible. And Facebook really did kind of start this almost like a new way of discriminating. Before this, housing advertisers didn't really have access to user data and user demographics, and they couldn't, target select people like that. So the Department of Justice said that Facebook has way more liability than what Craigslist might have. This case was actually settled before it went to trial. As part of that settlement agreement, Facebook said that they would make a bunch of changes to their advertising platform. They also agreed to pay $1.9 billion in damages, which sounds like a lot of money, but just to put that into perspective, that year alone, they made $40 billion in revenue. So 1.9 was a lot, but really just a drop in the bucket compared to what they could have paid and probably what they should have paid. And I do think it's worth mentioning again that, this case generated quite a bit of interest from HUD and from the Department of Justice, which tells us that enforcement agencies are paying attention to how housing advertisers are using big data. They're also paying attention to how target marketing is being used to sell real estate. So if you haven't done so already, now is really the time to develop a marketing strategy that avoids violating fair housing law via social media, because liability is always looming here, and this is just not an issue that's going away anytime soon. One good thing about this Facebook case is that it was really the first of its kind. So it was helpful in a way because it gave us at least some guideposts in understanding how the courts are starting to assign, this idea of publishers' liability to social media interactions. It also did kind of create a new question, though. And that new question is, where do we draw the line when we're assigning this publisher's liability? As a general rule, websites have immunity from publisher liability for, the things that third parties post to their websites, unless, of course, like Facebook, that website is doing something to engage in or to facilitate that bad behavior from the third parties. But, normal people, like real estate agents, like brokerages, we don't have that publisher's liability immunity. So, the question has been posed is, if I post an advertisement, or a listing on social media, and then other users make discriminatory comments, in the comment section of what I post, am I going to be liable for, say, fair housing violations in those comments because I'm the one who published that original post? So let's say that, I'm an agent and I have a business page on Facebook that I use to advertise myself and to advertise my listings. And let's say that I post a link to a link, and in the comment section, someone says, you don't want to live here. This neighborhood is full of fill in the blank, protected class. That comment is obviously a violation of fair housing law, but the question is, who's going to be liable for that comment? Obviously, the person who said the comment, but we also know that there's also publisher liability here. So is the agent who posted the listing liable because they were the one who published it? And the answer there is maybe. This hasn't been specifically tested, not in a court, at least not yet. We think it probably will be soon because this is just a question that keeps recurring. But right now, we don't know exactly how a court will come down on that. But based on the trending case law and based on, the attitudes that we're seeing from the court and from HUD, there is a really good argument that that agent could be held liable because they had the ability to exercise that editorial control over their publication, and then they chose not to. So I do think it's safe, at least, to say that the less control you have over your social media, over the things you post and put online, just means that there's more potential for liability, because if you are controlling and if you are monitoring those social media posts, there's just less likelihood that some kind of discriminatory comment is going to fall through the cracks. You really want to catch that stuff before the entire world sees it. So for that reason, brokerages are very much encouraged to, look at their internal policies and look at how they're using social media and ask, do we have a damage control policy? What do we do if someone posts a discriminatory comment to our page or to something that we post? Do we have a takedown policy? Who's responsible for, initiating the takedown? Do we have a social media policy in place? Those are all questions that need to be asked. And if there isn't some kind of procedure in place, then it might be time to start looking at that. Next slide, please. So, this is why we say that, brokerages are very much encouraged to implement some kind of social media policy. And I will say that, having a social media policy in place does not immediately absolve a brokerage from any and all liability, but, it is certainly a proactive measure that can help limit the liability. It really does pay to be proactive when we're talking about potential fair housing violations. This is not an area of the law where you want to be reactive, because if we are being reactive, it means that we are responding to a problem that already exists, and we want to stop that problem before it happens. If you've ever listened to me or Brian Westron or Brad Ward talk about fair housing, you've probably heard one of us say, if you're explaining yourself, you're already losing. And what we mean when we say that is that if you find yourself in a position where you are being asked to explain or justify, your words or your actions or your behaviors or your social media posts, as they relate to fair housing or some alleged fair housing violation, then you're already in a bad position, because it's likely that the damage is already done, damage to your reputation, damage to the community, to the brokerage, to the industry as a whole, just because of the negative press that is associated with fair housing violations and alleged fair housing violations. We live in an age where things go viral, and they go viral very quickly, and word gets out, and the damage can happen really fast to your business, to your reputation. So the best way to prevent that damage is to not let these fair housing violations or even allegations of fair housing violations happen in the first place, which can seem easier said than done. But, this is where a social media policy can be really helpful. These social media policies can be a great risk aversion tool for agents. It reminds us of our responsibilities under the law. For brokers, it reminds us of, or at least gives guidance on how to supervise online activity. Broker supervision is crucial. It's an occupational code requirement, but from a risk management perspective, it's also important, because at the end of the day, the broker bears that ultimate responsibility for the actions of their agents. So implementing, these internal controls like a social media policy can be really helpful. Again, it's not a get out of jail free card, right? It's not this magic wand that we wave and we say, well, there's a social media policy in place, so we're not going to be liable for anything. It doesn't work like that, but, it's definitely a preemptive measure that if it's used the right way, and if it really becomes part of the brokerage culture, it can help agents avoid fair housing violations and code of ethics violations and, other social media blunders that create liability for everybody. Next slide, please. If you are interested in implementing a social media policy, Michigan Realtors has drafted a model one. You can find it on our legal resource page, or I believe it's on our fair housing landing page now. It was designed to be used by brokerages, but it could easily be adopted by local associations or real estate teams, or just individual agents who are looking for some guideposts, in keeping their social media usage compliant in all aspects of the law, because this addresses more than just social media. It talks about, the appropriate way to make RPAC solicitations. It talks about antitrust, basic real estate advertising requirements, appropriate online language, which is one that we need to pay attention now to with the addition of standard of practice 10-5 to the code of ethics. So, and I will say that, this policy isn't something that's meant to be overly restrictive, and it's not mandatory. You absolutely do not have to use this. This is really just offered as a sort of framework to help realtors in keeping their social media usage compliant under the law, particularly fair housing law, but in all aspects, especially just general advertising. Next slide. All right, before we jump into these HUD guidelines, any questions about social media use in general? Yeah.
but I know that you can have discrimination, you said, because of age. How does the 55+ communities get away with that?
Yeah, okay, good question. So if you couldn't hear it online, the question was with age and protected class, how do 55+ communities get away with that? There's actually a caveat, there's a little carve out in the law that does allow advertising specifically to 55 and older communities if it is, a community meant for older persons. So that is one caveat in the law that you can target those classes if it's a 55 and older community. Good question. Any other questions? All right, so we're going to switch gears here and talk about these HUD guidelines. I mentioned earlier that there was some HUD guidance available for real estate advertising, and these HUD guidelines really just provide some general advertising rules for each protected class. They sort of attempt to address some of the confusion over certain words and phrases that have become problematic because of how they can be perceived. So we're going to take a look at some of these guidelines for the protected classes, and we're going to start with advertising that references religion. So the first rule here is, of course, no blanket phrases. So, you can't say things like Christians only or no, fill in the blank religion. That one's pretty obvious, right? You don't need me or Aaron to stand up here and tell you that you can't blanket ban certain religions from access to housing. That one's pretty common sense. But when we start talking about religious symbolism, sometimes when we're talking about symbolism, that isn't so common sense because it's a little bit more nuanced. So when we're talking about religious symbolism, like using a Christian cross or a Star of David or a crescent moon or anything like that in your real estate advertising, it can create a perception problem. One example here, and something that we see quite often, is where agents use certain religious symbols on their business cards or in other advertising. So for example, we see all the time agents who might use, put a Christian cross on their advertising, on their business cards, or maybe put a scripture quote. And their reason for using that stuff usually isn't to be discriminatory, right? It's not to try to deter individuals of other faiths, from doing business with them. At least I assume that most of them, that's not their intent, right? A lot of them just want to be representative of who they are. And they say, if I put, this religious reference on my business card, then everyone will know that these are my morals and these are my values and this is who I am as a business person. And I will say that practice is not wholly forbidden. There's nothing written into the law that says that you cannot do that. However, it can be problematic under fair housing law. From a risk management perspective, it just opens the door to scrutiny, and it just opens the door for people to ask whether or not you're complying with fair housing law. Those symbols could be viewed as a preference. They could be viewed as exclusionary. They could be perceived as maybe an attempt to say, this is the religion that I work with. It creates that perception problem, which is what we always want to avoid. So if you do use religious symbolism in your advertising, well, first I would encourage you not to, but if you do, I would also encourage you to go out of your way to also include some kind of fair housing disclaimer, or maybe, the equal opportunity logo in that same piece of advertising to maybe offset any perception problems, because you just really do not want to be put in a position where you want to explain yourself. Because again, if you are explaining yourself, you're already losing, and that's what we want to avoid. One other thing to note here with religious symbolism is getting a handle on knowing the difference between the symbolism that is secular and actually religious, because there are certain words and phrases that have become so secularized that HUD at least says that they are not considered discriminatory if you use them in your advertising. So for example, phrases like, Merry Christmas or Mardi Gras, or using a symbol like Santa Claus or a Christmas tree or an Easter egg. HUD at least has said that these are symbols and phrases that have become so popularized in our culture that they no longer necessarily hold a religious meaning. They might hold a religious meaning to people who practice that religion, but they can be used in advertising without being perceived as discriminatory. So if you say you put out a quarterly newsletter and you say, you know, come join us for the tree lighting in December, you know, you can say that stuff. HUD says that it's not discriminatory. Next slide. All right, so HUD also has guidance for familial status and marital status. And again, I think the key here is just sticking to descriptions about the property. Do not describe a potential occupant. For marital status, this one's pretty straightforward. You just don't want to express a preference for or against couples or for or against single individuals. So for example, you know, I would avoid using the phrase bachelor pad, avoid using the phrase perfect for newlyweds or ideal for, you know, fill in the blank. Anytime you're saying perfect for or ideal for, there's a red flag. With regard to familial status, this one's also pretty straightforward. You just don't want to express a preference for or against families with children under the age of 18. That's how the law defines familial status, whether or not you have children in the home under the age of 18. So any, and this is especially important in rental housing, you really don't want to limit the number or the ages of children who are allowed in a housing unit. You also don't want to put any extra restrictions on families with children. So for example, if I'm a property manager, instead of saying, you know, no children's toys on the balcony, we would just want to say no personal property on the balcony, because we don't want to place any extra restrictions on families. You know, those rules should not target a specific protected class. If you have a rule in place, it should be applicable to anyone who rents that unit, not just certain members of certain protected classes. One thing to also note here, and again, this comes up a lot with familial status, is that city rental ordinances might have limitations on occupancy. And that's okay. Those rental ordinances are there for public safety reasons. So you could say in your advertising for a rental unit, this unit is only licensed for 4 occupants. That's fine, but you still shouldn't reference families or children. So while it might be okay to say, you know, only licensed for 4 occupants, you couldn't say, you know, no large families, or, you know, no more than 2 children per unit. You really want to avoid, again, targeting any type of protected class. And then one more here before we close it out. Next slide. HUD also has guidance for using human models. And I think that the key here is just, again, it's about perception. It's being aware of the perception that comes when you have human models present in any type of real estate advertising. Because we're advertising for the property, right? We're not advertising for a type of person, and using a human model really just opens the door to fair housing scrutiny and potential fair housing liability. So the general rule, or I should say best practice here, is to avoid using human models in any advertisement for housing, because it's just too easy, you know, to be frank, it's just too easy to mess it up. Fair housing advocacy groups are out there and they are monitoring for lack of diversity, and they are looking for patterns in advertisements that highlight certain protected classes, and they are looking, you know, for the use of human models that target certain demographics. Yeah, question.
When we put our clients with the sold signs and we put that out as advertisements, are we putting ourselves?
Yeah, I don't think there's a problem with that. If you didn't hear it online, the question was, you know, putting up pictures of your clients with, you know, their sold signs. That's because that's a true picture of your advertising, right? If that's the client who bought your home, you know, it's okay to advertise that. I think that the only problem you would have in doing that is if you were picking and choosing, you know, certain protected classes of clients, saying, well, I'm going to take pictures of the happy family who just bought the home because that's really good for advertising, and I'm not going to take a picture of, you know, the single guy who just bought the home. So as long as you're being consistent in that, there's there's not a problem. If you do use human models and other forms of advertising, again, I would encourage against it. But if you do, I would just do best to, again, paint a true picture of the business and do your best to show diversity. So, if your advertisements are focusing on a particular protected class, just, balance it with diversity in other advertisements. If your ad focuses, on maybe families or couples, then, show some with singles. Or if it focuses on young people, also show some with older people. The key is balance there and knowing where to draw that line. So I think that I'm right up against my time. Are there any questions on the HUD guidelines or social media advertising or protected classes or anything on your mind? Real estate law, not other stuff. Don't ask me about a divorce. I couldn't help. No? All right. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having Aaron. If you want copies of these slides, we can make sure that those are available to you. My contact information is also on there. So if you think of any questions, reach out and I'm happy to answer anything you got. Thanks.